Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear listeners, this episode marks my very first online podcast recording via Zoom with the esteemed Professor Rattan Lal Hangloo, a renowned historian whose profound scholarship on Kashmiri history, medieval India, and cultural heritage has illuminated countless minds. As a novice to virtual interviews, you might notice a few unpolished moments in the flow. My apologies for such hiccups. I promise to refine my skills and deliver smoother experience in future episodes. Professor Rattan Lal Hangloo is a distinguished Indian historian renowned for his expertise in South Asian history, Kashmir's material culture, agrarian economy, and political conflicts. He earned his BA and MA from Kashmir University in Srinagar, followed by an MPhil and PhD in 1979 from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. As Professor of History at the University of Hyderabad from 1998 to 2019, where he also had the Department of History, acted as Dean of Students' Welfare and Chief Proctor. He held prestigious leadership roles as Vice Chancellor of Kalyani University and the University of Allahabad. Good evening to our viewers. We are actually honored today to greet a great guest, a man who lives with history. Good day to our listeners. It has been said that while the layman lives in the fleeting moment, the scholar resides in the long duty, the vast unfolding stretch of human time. So we are here to discuss actually the nature of history, what actually history is, and what do we understand that we know about history. In this regard, I have actually prepared a set of questions to ask our revered and great Dr. Sahab, who does not need any introduction, a man who has worked abroad and has been VC in many Indian universities. I am referring to honored Dr. Professor Rattan Lal Hangloo, sir, the son of the soil, the man who belongs from our own state, that's Jammu and Kashmir. Sir, my first question goes like this. E.H. Carr famously defined history as an unending dialogue between the past and the present. So, Professor Sahab, in our past truth era, this dialogue become a monologue of the present where we simply project our current bias onto the past? Because E.H. Carr has rightly said that before dealing with the history, you are supposed to read the historian because there are always some prior prejudices or basic speculations in the mind of the historian. So, in that context, this was our first question. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Irfan Saab. Very good morning to all the viewers. Assalamu alaikum to all of you. And namaste to those also who must be listening. I would at the very outset thank you for having me, number one. Number two, I also hope that you will give me adequate time.
Yes, sir.
To reply to these excellent questions, which is the need of the hour, because nobody is talking what is happening to history these days. When we talk about, E.H. Carr's history and contemporary scene, I would say the definitions have changed a lot now. You see, history in our times is critical study of how the past is contested, constructed, remembered, forgotten, and used in present through power, evidence, and interpretation. You know, this is now already different from the older definitions that treated history as neutral record of past, what actually happened in the past, and so on. History is no longer just the past, I would say, because earlier in 19th century Ranke showed history is showing the past as it actually was. If we go little back, you can imagine there was dateless past also at one point of time, before Herbert Butterfield and many others, in fact, when beginning of the history started and so on. Today we are far more suspicious. We recognize that the past does not speak for itself. Archives are produced by states, elites, and victors. Silence and absences are also historical factors today. So history is now understood as a relationship between past events, present questions. We don't study past for its own sake anymore. We study it because the present is unsettled. And because for Kashmiris, in fact, the political future is unsettled, I would say. If we look at our Kashmir's history, history is about power. It's about power as much as about time. Because if you look at, say, modern historiography, who had the power to record, and who was excluded, which memories became tradition and which became, folklore or myth. There are lots of these kinds of memories which we classify and characterize. Therefore, we find that history is the analysis of power operating through time.
Okay.
This is why we can see that subaltern history, for example, feminist history, Dalit history, indigenous history, post-colonial history, which emerged not as add-on, but as corrections to what was being counted as history.
What was being actually counted as
History
history?
is
Yes.
interpretative, not factual, because facts matter. But factors do not arrange themselves, because when we collect so much of material, truckloads of material,
Hmm.
they don't explain us, and we cannot provide that directly to the audience.
Hmm.
While writing history, we have to see what are the generalizations. So therefore, it is much more depending on the mind of human being, so that he is not loyal to any prejudice. Because history involves interpretation, it involves theory, it involves ethical stance, it also involves political implication. History is basically, we find, it's an evidence interpretation, but everything has to be done very responsibility, because responsibility matters, because historical narratives, pertain to, and they shape, more importantly, nations, civilizations, identities. They shape also conflicts, claims of legitimacy, for example. So therefore, history includes memory, myth, and silence. What is this myth told? How anxiety is involved in this? What we conceal and what we reveal. These are different kinds of jobs of historians also, irrespective of the fact that historian has to be, you know, uh, very objective. He has tried to be as objective as possible. So history nowadays studies, it studies collective memory, for example, trauma, ritual, forgetting, erasure. Myth is not false history, it's socially meaningful history also.
Hmm.
When we say mythicization, for example, even this is especially important in societies like Kashmir, India, Africa, Latin America, where we have written archives, which are partially violent also in sometimes. A concise and contemporary definition would be that history today is critical, evidence-based inquiry into how human societies have evolved,
Hmm.
understand narratives, and contest their pasts in relation to present power and future possibilities. That's what I would say.
Exactly. Very nice, sir. You have also worked extensively with Persian and Sanskrit primary sources. How does the language
Yeah.
of the historian shape the reality of the history? And how do we know that what we know today?
You see, you're all the excellent questions, they really compel me to probe it further. But I would say, you see, language decides and counts as an event.
Okay.
I remember when I was selected for PhD, and intended to do PhD, I first did BA Persian
Okay,
to
that's great.
understand sources of medieval history. Those days, nearly
So
50
that you
years
can
back
directly
now.
dig from the
But
actual sources.
yeah, so that one can read, because all those sources also, in fact, we can have a big debate in Kashmir and other places also. You have a history, Persian history, for example, but the author has no guts to put his name on the subject, on the text. Now, how do we take it? It's an authentic. It's
Yes,
something
that's
like
true.
writing a false complaint against somebody,
Hmm.
Baharistan Shahi, for example. So
That's the
therefore, language decides.
we don't know
Yeah,
the
anonymous,
actual
yes.
author who has written Baharistani Shahi. And just a
Some
month
people
back,
say.
the debate on Haba Khatun raised because she was not mentioned in Baharistani Shahi.
Right, right. You are very right. Suppose language decides what counts as an event, for example. Compare a riot broke out in a city, for example. The city witnessed and organized program. Communal tensions escalated. The same occurrence, entirely different historians explain differently. Why? Because language is an agency to provide us who did what. It hides and reveals also. You know, when you look at language, it normalizes and criminalizes also in terms of violence. The way you use the language, for example,
Yes.
language determines whether something appears as an accident or say structure or crime. And grammar hides power. Historians often use passive constructions. For example, villages were destroyed, they would mention. People were displaced. Mistakes were made. By
Hmm.
whom? You know, this is not stylistic neutrality, it's a political erasure. Active voices restores, they restore history. The army destroyed villages, for example, would be clarity. The state displaced communities, for example. Thus, grammar is also a kind of technology, but also a responsible technology, we can say. You know, vocabulary encodes in language. Vocabulary is another important aspect which encodes, words carry theoretical baggage. For example, reform, there was a progress. We assume, in fact, as historians, when we say, if I say that 14th century, 15th century, Zainal Abidin's time or Sheikh Abdullah's time, that reform took place, everybody would, sort of conceive it as a progress. Or for example, when we say decline, so everybody feels that there was a total decay. Or we talk of civilization, we immediately, sort of conceive of hierarchy.
Hmm.
Or for example, we talk of tribe, everybody feels that perhaps they may be completely primitive. Or integration, there was some center to which integrates. This is language. You can imagine, this is language I am deliberately telling you and again telling you that whenever we talk of reform, we talk of thinking that there was a progress, and there may not have been progress despite the fact that there was a reform. We had a land reform in Kashmir. What happened? We never had a land reform. We had land reform in India, but what happened? Likewise, we talk of decline, and there was like 18th century, for example. When we say decline at the time of Mughals, for example, 18th century decline, the decline was not total. Trade and commerce was growing. We find immense amount of debate about it by Professor Satish Chandra, Professor Harbans Mukhya, my great teacher. So therefore, one has chosen these words could pre-interpret the past. Therefore, one has to be very careful about language also. That's why modern historians fight over terms like, we have a great debate about Aryan migration versus movement. They also fight on annexation versus accession. They also fight on conversion and social reorientation. Different kinds of concepts, arguments, which are disguised as norms, for example. You see, narratives structure, for example. How do narratives structure? Because they create meaning. History is told as rise, peak and fall, crisis, reform and resolution, for example, or tradition and modernity in terms. These are literary plots, not natural laws, actually. You see, when we talk in terms of language, we have, even for arranging chronology, we also find that for arranging chronology also language plays a very, very significant role, you know, because narratives give causality where there may have or may have not been chaos. Metaphors, for example, we find in language, metaphor that shapes the imagination, because some of the historians who constantly use, in terms of roots of nation, for example, birth of modernity, the terms like body politic, margins and center. Metaphors are not decoration. They naturalize abstractions. They also make power seem organic,
Hmm.
I would say, or turn social construction into what we say nature, for example. So therefore, metaphor is unconscious, sort of historical, is the unconsciousness of historical writing, I would say,
So great,
unconsciously.
dear
Yeah.
Professor. Today,
The
actually, we are
point that
dealing
you talked
with
about silence, the point that you talked about silence, in this question is uh, what is not named. Silence to me would be what is not named, like
what's not
women
named.
in
Yes.
earlier history, labor in earlier.
Hmm.
Yeah, for example, caste in earlier history, sexuality in earlier history,
Hmm.
everyday life in earlier history.
Earlier
It was
history.
not recorded there. Yeah, it often excluded not by malice but by habit of language,
Hmm.
because the kind of language were used, society, they were used only to elites, religion they only meant texts, and politics they meant rulers. For example, if we talk of religion, people will talk about Gita, Quran, Bible, and so on. But
Yes.
what about the person who is immensely devout, like Shamas Fakir, Wahab Khar,
As
top devout,
a
Lalesh,
mystic, a spiritual
Sundaresh,
entity.
who are also very much more religious than anybody else, I would say.
Yes,
Much more
exactly.
spiritual. They are higher, in fact.
But
You
they are
know,
not giving a belonging to a particular thing or to a particular set.
yeah.
Continuing the
So
argument, I
therefore,
would like to ask one more question, sir. Collingwood argued that all history is the history of thought. Do you believe a
yeah.
historian's job is to record actions or to perform a psychological reconstruction? Actually, we are dealing with the nature of this very subject.
Absolutely. As I said in the beginning, that your questions are really remarkable, I would
Thank
say.
you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Uh, we say, for example, in this, I would say that history cannot be absolutely reliable,
Hmm.
you know, but it can be responsibly reliable. The difference matters. Let me again explain, for example, without evasions, why history can never be fully reliable. Because history fails the test of absolute reliability for structural reasons, not because historians are very careless, those who are real historians. The past is gone. We cannot re-observe it. There is no doubt about it. We cannot run experiments of the past, for example, as people do in films. We cannot cross-examine the people who are already dead. Unlike natural sciences, history deals with irreversible time. And secondly, the second part of this argument would be, I would say, in terms of question of evidence, for example. You know, what survives? Written, we find records preserved by institutions, filtered through language, censorship, and accident. For example, what does US do throughout the world? But what is given to historian is, they say decoded and declassified document from CIA. They may have run havoc, in Iraq
Hmm.
and other countries and so on. But ultimately, we will get what is declassified. So therefore, we will not get to the root of it. Therefore, absence of evidence, uh, or evidence of absence also you can call it, but is often gets treated as such. So therefore, the interpretation becomes unavoidable. Facts do not, they don't explain much unless the historian's account requires basically selection. It's, you see, up to us to select what do we want to select. For example, where do we want to, while writing, emphasize, or where do we want to frame, where do we want a kind of casual linkages. Therefore, history cannot escape interpretation, and interpretation introduces, you see, uncertainty,
So
but
it's
not
nice.
fully reliable. Not mean that anything goes wrong in it. There is where people, we can say, where people go wrong. History is not fiction, propaganda, or say free storytelling. These days it has become a fashion. You see,
Hmm.
if you look at everybody who has a ledger, he will write something and say that this is history of Anantnag, this is history of Srinagar, this is history of Delhi. Somebody having time. It happens in, I have seen in my community also, a lot of people picking it up and saying history without knowing the methodology of understanding history, leaving aside, the question of writing later. So therefore, what makes history rebel in a very limited and, I would say, real sense, is evidence still matters. You cannot claim responsibility. An empire existed without records, for example. A famine without, demographic traces. I would give an example. We find Jean Marshall did a wonderful work when Indus civilization was written about, and explored, and archaeology, all these things. His great contribution, which cannot be denied. But if you look at the latest researches, you see, earlier we would assume that with the coming of Aryans in 1500 BC, the Indus Valley civilization was plundered, looted, people were killed, and that's how it was destroyed. But
Exactly.
today, when we look at it, the new research, the new evidence has come. Basically, there was a famine. People died because of famine,
Okay.
lack of food, and
Not because
that's
of
how.
the
So
clean
therefore,
streak.
evidence. Yeah, and therefore, what we say is basically evidence sets boundaries, even if it does not dictate conclusions.
So, coming to this very part, the debate between history and science and history as art persists. Given history ever to be truly reliable, or is it, as Napoleon cynically suggested, merely a fable argued upon?
You see, there are lots of things actually which we feel while writing history, what gets into it. As I said, there is a memory, there's a trauma, there's a lived experience. And eyewitness memory, when we look at it, in fact, there is always a little amount of emotionally charged atmosphere. which often, makes it factually unstable.
Hmm.
Because while writing history, for example, I would give a very, very interesting thing. You see, I wrote something about conversions in Kashmir and went on exploring this for a long period of time. Then I studied these days Shaivism, and I find my conclusions about conversion that there was not much of violence as is predicted by common men and those people who become historians overnight. I find there was not violence, it was voluntary, because there were so many other circumstances which led to the conversion. It was not
Okay.
that somebody was having the Quran in hand and sword in another hand, and that's why he converted people. No, circumstances because were different. So therefore, truth may be plural without sort of being arbitrary. A contemporary, I would say, definition would mean that in our times, history is labeled when it is transparent about sources,
Hmm.
when it is honest about limits, when it is open about revision, and when it is resistant to political pressure. You see, for example, look at the kind of history that is being written. We have the battles of NCRT books in India. So
Yes.
therefore, a historian has not to be tempted, he has not to be loyal to prejudice, he has to be resistant to political pressure. That has to be kept in mind, which leads to formulation that history is labeled not because it is final, but because it is, corrigible, I would say.
Ah, that's very great, Professor. Coming to interdisciplinary frontiers, history and anthropology were once described as kin, with the only difference being that one studies the past and other the present. How has the anthropological turn challenged your methodology when looking at Kashmiri social structures?
Uh, yeah, I would say that when we look at this aspect of anthropology, and you are giving me sweet memories about our region, Kashmir. You see, anthropology helps history by teaching historians how to see what texts cannot show.
Hmm.
you know the archival material are chronological, texts of histories like Tariq Kashmir, Baharistan Shahi, that Dadmari's work, or Kalhana's work, and so on. So therefore, anthropology helps historians by teaching historians how to see what texts cannot show us. Because if history traditionally asked what happened, anthropology asks how people lived.
How people lived, yes.
If history says what happened, but anthropology teaches how people lived in food, how they made meaning and reproduced their worlds, you know, especially when left little or no written record, for example. Therefore, anthropology comes in. I would say anthropology expands what counts as historical evidence. It expands what is referred to as historically. I have used always with regard to Kashmir. Also, I have always used anthropological tools,
Hmm.
because classical history privileged. There are only it is privileged because there are only in classical form you find texts, dates, events, rulers, which people are sometimes fed up also. But when you look at anthropology, we look into the rituals, we look into kinship, we look into food, we look into space, we look into dress, we look into disease, we look into gesture, habit, belief, oral memory.
Hmm.
I would say one thing, for example, we have a great festival, you see, Shivratri, we say here in Kashmiri, isn't it?
Yes.
If you study every Sanskrit manuscript pertaining to Shaivism, if you study every history, there's no mention of these things. You will see
Okay.
how things have been mythicized. I'll give you, when we talk about Kashmir, for example, if you talk to a couple of historians there in Kashmir and tell them that we have a past of Nagas, they will say, no, 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 we were not snake worshippers, we were not Nagas. They confuse, they don't understand, because Naga was mythified by Vedic Brahmins. When Vedic
Okay.
Brahmins came, they did not want Naga to survive in historical memory as a ruler, because then he would be rival of the contemporary ruler at that point of time.
That's great. Yes.
You see, if I say today, you have seen how Aurangzeb is being treated, Akbar is being treated, and many other things. If instead Obul Fazl should have written that Akbar was a sort of, he was a mythical kind of thing, he was a deity and not a ruler, then we have no battles. If Aurangzeb was stated that
This is how
he was a
myths and
goat, for
history are
example.
actually intertwined to form a new dimension.
Absolutely. And anthropology in this case plays a very, very significant role, in understanding these formats like, for example, power, gender, pollution, authority, cosmic order, ritual, apparatus, so many other things. And it helps, sort of to replace, sort of discussion sometimes because anthropology has that fellow, what was his name? Clifford Greaves, for example. He called this that thick description, you know, not just because what people did, but why it motivated them to do what they did. Therefore, history is influenced by anthropology. It describes worlds, not just changes. And it reconstructs moral universe. It also explains symbols, emotions, you know, peasant revolts, for example, because peasants violated moral expectations of, reciprocity when subsistence norms collapsed. Look at European feudalism. Look at the force of problems of Begar in, Kashmiri context.
Yeah. So
How people were being
coming to the last
for
part of
Begar
our
and
program, I am simply
right.
trying to intervene into science. For example, with the advent of DNA sequencing and carbon dating, is the
Right.
scientific
Right.
record beginning to override the textual record? How should a traditional historian, I
Uh,
mean to say, balance these two often conflicting testimonies?
you see, I would say, what do we mean by scientific?
Hmm.
When we talk in terms of scientific, by scientific record, we usually mean, say, for example, archaeology, carbon dating.
Hmm.
In terms of history, for genetics, DNA testing, population studies, for example, demography, paleoclimatology, or say environmental data or material analysis, these produce non-textual evidence, you know, that does not depend on, say, elite narration. Therefore, why scientific records gain, authority now is basically because textual history was dominating. You know,
Hmm.
writing was treated as truth. Whatever somebody has written, even if it was false, it was treated as truth. That's why science comes in. Archives were equated with objectivity. You see, look at those people who did research earlier. The teachers would say that, no, 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 you must attend to archives, as if the final word was there available in archives. I mean, archives also we see records which are prejudicial, which are biased. So why should, therefore, we find that's why science gained legitimacy, because writing was, as I said, it was treated as truth. Archives were treated as the most objective, sort of, I would say, areas, and literate elites were setting the historical agenda at that point of time. Abul Fazl writing, sitting on a carpet with all cushions around, with good food around, with good money, with good land grant, and so on. And then he would write, you know, that is the kind of history writing. Or Kalhana, the son of a minister, writing at that. Although Kalhana really stands, alone, I would say sometimes, because he has not left even his father from critiquing the system. And
Yes.
when he wrote, I tell you, his writing itself was a great revolution in terms of what was happening in Kashmir and the kind of worse circumstances that were going on. Because if we read Khemindra, he gives us also details. I am really deviating here, but let me come back to your question. That you see, over time, when scholars realized that texts, they exaggerate, they omit, they reflect ideological bias also. Many societies were never primarily textualized also,
Hmm.
where people are biased. Therefore, scientific methods offered independent verification and falsification also. That's why their authority has grown. What scientific records, whether they can override or not, I would say in some domains they do override. For example, if a text claims a city existed in 3000 BC,
So the radiocarbon
you
dating will
know,
come into the place.
carbon dating will certainly show,
Hmm.
yeah, it says the particular civilization emerged in 1200 BC, for example.
Exactly.
You see, the scientific record sets it right. Texts might glorify, but you see, science would provide a kind of purity, I would say, to history writing, because texts might glorify in terms of eternal abundance, for example. Our pollen data, our ice cores show long droughts, but science corrects narrative. Genetics may show its own details, admixture or migration. So science does disrupt identity, it does disrupt myth, where texts make empirical claims about time, material, or population, for example.
Yes, sir.
Then what happens? Science can override them. There is the question of science overriding, because scientific records as such do not override. This is crucial because science cannot replace texts when it comes to
Hmm.
meaning, intention, symbolism, morality, or say political imagination, for example. Therefore, a second cannot simply tell you why a ritual mattered, how people understood God, what legitimacy meant. One Sickleton, if we take scientifically human Sickleton. Therefore, science explains conditions, tests, explains consciousness. The earlier model, for example, text was archaeology confirms. Current model is text, we find material, environment, memory. No single source is sovereign. That is what science has proved. That no
Exactly.
single source can be hegemonic. So now history emerges from basically triangulation. Why overriding is I would say overriding is a wrong metaphor. You see, because scientific records are also interpreted, have margins of error,
Definitely,
depend on
yes. Nothing
sampling,
is ultimate.
very low. So therefore, scientific data constrains history, it does not narrate it.
It does not narrate it, but it actually plays a very vital role.
It plays a very, because scientific records override textual history only where texts make testable claims, for example,
Hmm.
and material reality about material. Elsewhere, they function as correction partners, I would say, rather than replacements. So texts tell us what people said, science tells us what the world allowed history.
Yes.
You know, uh, so history lives in between, I would say.
We are left with 10 minutes only, so I will be hurrying in asking my last question. That's to those who claim history is irrelevant in a tech driven future, if we lose our historical consciousness, do we lose our ability to act as ethical citizens? Does it actually mean that history is irrelevant in nowadays? It has lost its relevance.
I would say history is not irrelevant, and real history would never become irrelevant. So far as human civilization are concerned. Um, for example, you see, take Kashmir. Why Kashmir sharpens the material, in terms of textual problem? Because Kashmir has a rich textual tradition. Puranas, Kalhana, Shaiva, Tantric, Persian history, migration from Central Asia, a thin but suggestive material, for example, record archaeology, landscape, hydrology, strong mythical history or mythical memories, Naga, Satisar. They do align smoothly, but their friction is producing, certain questions. What each mode of them reveals is basically, for example, if I give you the Satisar myth, a textual version. Kashmir was a lake as Satisar drained by Kashyapa, Nagas subdued or integrated land opened. But this reads a civilizational foundation from the other way. Narrative order replacing the chaos. A sort of legitimizing story of later times. And geological, hydrological studies confirm the valley was once a lake. Drainage occurred gradually over a period of time. Then settlement, in terms of archaeology, also shows slow habitation, continuity rather than sudden colonization. Could you repeat again? I'm here deviating. Can you again put
You
this
see, to
question
those who
across?
claim history is irrelevant in tech driven future, if we lose our historical consciousness, do we lose our ability to act as ethical citizens?
In a way, you're right in the sense that basically history would, as I said, it would always be relevant,
Hmm.
because it is history only which tells us the different transitions that have taken place in human society, those transitions through which we have come down to our present. It is because of history that we know our present and past.
Exactly, yes.
And in this present and past, it is not merely textual detail, but the kind of transition that we had from, say, for example, a digging stick of
Hmm.
ancient times to modern harvesters, to modern tractors, You know, there's a long centuries together have passed in terms of production of this kind of technology, which assured a transition from primitive life to modernity with various stages in between, in fact. So therefore, nobody can ignore history, and historical consciousness, I would say, is as important for human beings as food.
Hmm.
It is rather historical consciousness much more important than religion for human beings, I would say.
Okay.
Because it is through the eyes of historical consciousness that we understand other human beings, that we understand environment, that we understand, animal kingdom. Nowadays we understand space and many other things. You see how transformation has taken place. So therefore, historical consciousness is very, very, I would say, essential part of human society.
Thank you. We have come to end our program. We are left with 1 minute. And before making a formal
Yeah.
closure, I will say, Professor Sahab, you have given us a master class in intellectual
Thank
humility
you so
today. You have shown us that history is not a destination, but a rigorous ongoing process of questioning. Thank you for reminding us that while we cannot change the past, the way we remember it changes who we are today. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.